Right now, there's a lot of talk of Cardano Stakepool decentralization in the future. Will it be a thing or will it not? That is probably of vital interest to us all, and it's also why there's so much chatter right now around minimum attack vectors and Nakamoto coefficients. This is also a very emotionally charged issue since the livelihoods of many different stake pool operators on both sides of the debate are on the line. Regardless of who's right, the real questions are whether or not there is any workable means to preserve decentralization and what level of decentralization fulfills that standard. Ready? Let's go. Today, we will discuss the hot topic of pool decentralization. We'll talk about things like minimum attack vectors, Nakamoto coefficients, possible solutions like parameters such as A naught and K, conclave-esque type answers, a tall prism identity ideas, and even social pressure. But first, I have a surprise. Ever since this channel began, I've been inundated with questions about why there is no Army of Spies stake pool. People slide in my DMs. What is your stake pool ticker? Why don't you have a stake pool? When are you starting a stake pool? It's been pretty constant ever since the start of the channel. It's become too hard to debate. This community is too big, and I spend way too much time thinking about Cardano every day to not be involved in the validation of the blocks on the blockchain. So in the spirit of this video, we're going to start a stake pool. It's going to happen after the Sunday Swap ISO. At some point after the ISO, I don't know exactly when we're going to launch, but it's going to be shortly after the Sunday Swap ISO. Details to be announced. Stay tuned. Everyone is very concerned in Cardano that these two numbers, the Nakamoto coefficient and the minimum attack vector, are going down. So let's start with, what do these numbers even mean? I could be wrong, but I believe the idea of a Nakamoto coefficient was first popularized by this post by Balaji Srinivasan and Leyland Lee. So in this post, they talk about the related concepts of Gini coefficients and Lorenz curves. And they go to some length to explain to you exactly how they came to the idea of a Nakamoto coefficient. Lots of graphs, lots of curves. I'll let you go into their original post and read it on your own if you're very, very interested in all of these different metrics. But we can kind of come to the crux of the issue down here. They come to this idea eventually, the Nakamoto coefficient. They say, we define the Nakamoto coefficient as the minimum number of entities in a given subsystem required to get to 51% of the total capacity. This is pretty familiar. Obviously, these are crypto people writing this post, Balaji Srinivasan and Leyland Lee, and everyone in crypto, not everyone, but most people who've been around crypto for a certain amount of time are at least a little bit aware of the idea of a 51% attack. This is the idea that if you control 51% of the block validation in a blockchain, you can attack the blockchain. So of course, everyone is terrified at the thought of their favorite blockchain having any kind of concentration of validation that approaches 51%. So they've come up with this coefficient called the Nakamoto coefficient that has to do with the minimum number of entities to get to this 51% of the total capacity. In the case of a blockchain, that would be 51% control of the block validation power. In a proof of work blockchain, this would be 51% the hash rate. And in a proof of stake blockchain where you have delegation to stake pools, this would be 51% of the delegation. You should be aware that I'm putting words into the mouths of the authors here. They definitely leave a lot of room for debate about what are the sort of essential subsystems in any given system or network. And they are pretty general. They say the Nakamoto coefficient is the minimum number of entities in a given subsystem required to get 51% of the total capacity. So while they just look at Ethereum and Bitcoin here, both of which were proof of work at the time of this post, this Nakamoto coefficient idea has been extrapolated out to proof of stake and many other things in crypto. This same idea is often now expressed as a minimum attack vector or MAV number. This would be usually the number of validators that would have to collude or sort of be controlled in common in order to attack the network. You can see here in this graph from Cardano fans that going back to Epic 288, we were at a MAV of 26 and we're now down to a MAV of 22. You can see this same phenomenon in a different visual format if you go to adapools.org and then you go to the Cardano Donuts page under analysis. So you can see here that single pool operators make up 71.89% of pools by number. It looks like there are currently 3,138 pools. And if you look at the control of the stake, if I counted correctly, it's about 21 pools, just 21 pools here who control a majority of the total delegated stake, which is at 23.905 billion. These donut graphs come to us from at Danny Crypto Faye. These numbers are obviously vastly better than blockchains like Ethereum and Bitcoin, where you just have to control 3 or 4 or 5 gigantic mining pools in order to hit that minimum attack vector number. But I think everybody in Cardano, almost everybody would agree, we'd like to see a lot more delegation in this part of the donut graph and a little bit less in this part. Or to say it in a different way, we'd like to see this part that controls a majority of the delegated stake to expand way further over into here. So there's a much larger number of pools required to hit that 51% of delegated stake. Let's talk about the solutions that have been put on the table. Here we are at Cardano.org, the foundation's website, where they talk about Cardano protocol parameters. And protocol parameters are typically the first things that people go to when they start demanding an answer to the decentralization issue, the decentralization thing. One of the funniest, unintentionally funniest things I see is when people send tweets to Charles Hoskinson telling him he needs to fix decentralization now. And he's sort of like, what do you want me to do? So typically what they point to are these two parameters, A naught and K. So A naught is the influence of pledge. Here's what the CF has to say, Cardano.org at least. While there is no required minimum pledge amount, pool operators can optionally pledge some or all of their stake to their pool to make their pool more attractive. The higher the amount of ADA pledge, the more rewards the pool will receive, which will attract more delegation. The A0 protocol parameter defines the influence of the pledge on the pool reward. Then we have the K parameter. So we've seen changes to K in the past. You'll remember, so K determines the saturation point of pools, and it changes a little bit over time. You'll remember when we moved from a much higher saturation level down to, I think after the initial move, it was 64 million was the saturation point of pools, and now that is hiked up as time has gone on. But these are the two parameters that people always point to. So what we know is that even if you change K, I believe K is currently at 500, and a lot of people are pushing for K to go to 1,000. And even if we push K to 1,000, what seems to be the case is that all of the pools that are in that sort of minimum attack vector, it seems to be predictable that they will just cut all of their pools in half. They will just double the amount of pools they have in order to satisfy the new parameters set out by K, this K change. If we went from K equals 500 to K equals 1,000. So it seems like changing K won't really do the trick for us. As far as A naught goes, the influence of pledge, it seems that similarly, changing the amount of pledge, like increasing the amount of required pledge for the pool to receive its full rewards, won't really change anything anyways, because it's the pools in that minimum attack vector that are typically making the most money. They're the most able to meet these higher pledge requirements. And if we up pledge, it makes it more difficult for new pools to start. I mean, we could push pledge very high, and it'll just mean that the established stake pool operators who already have a lot of ADA in a lot of cases, they'll be able to meet that pledge and new pools wouldn't be able to meet it. So it doesn't seem like changing the A naught parameter will solve this problem either. Another solution I often see put forward is, hey, we'll never be able to keep the stake pools decentralized until we start using a Tala Prism. And then they always want to employ some kind of plan that sounds like it boils down to something like one human per stake pool. It's like, we'll have everybody prove their identity, and you've got to be a separate identity in order to be an SPO. So you can't have the situation where one party is running, like 6, 12 pools, whatever their target decentralization is. I love Atala Prism. I think Atala Prism is a fascinating identity solution. And I think we as a Cardano community are going to do big things with Atala Prism. Big things are already being done with the Ethiopian Ministry of Education. We've talked about all that a million times on this channel. But I think there is value in permissionless validation of a blockchain. Permissionlessness is one of the cornerstones of the whole crypto blockchain movement. One of the reasons that Bitcoin has always been so unstoppable is that there's no central registry anywhere of all the block validators in Bitcoin. There's no list somewhere of all the people mining Bitcoin, because if there was, any fascist government in the world, and there are many, could go to that list and say, hey, are any of our citizens on this list? If so, go round them up. That doesn't exist for a reason. That's part of the reason that Bitcoin has been so unstoppable. The validation of the blocks on the Bitcoin network have always been permissionless. Currently in Cardano, becoming a stake pool operator is fairly permissionless. Sure, you have to register your stake pool, but you don't have to KYC yourself and prove your identity as a human being, because if you did, you could come up with schemes where you would validate your identity as a human being and it wouldn't be stored in any central repository. But that's not the same as a largely permissionless system. That would be a permission system. And I think anytime we take away from the permissionlessness of a blockchain, we're losing something. Who knows? Maybe the regulators will figure out how to make us KYC our stake pools, but let's let them fight us to get there. Let's not do it to ourselves. A variation on that same idea is auto delegation at the protocol level. This is the idea that we would just build something additional in Ouroboros so that you don't get to choose which stake pool you go to. It sort of like takes away all of your free license as an individual actor in the ecosystem, and Ouroboros will just evenly distribute all the delegation across all of the pools. The problem here is performance. Not all of the pools deserve delegation. Some of the pools aren't doing what they're supposed to. And we need Adam Smith's hidden hand, the free market, to winnow out those pools that aren't doing a good job. They should have less delegation. They should have maybe zero delegation if they're doing a terrible enough job. But if Ouroboros is auto-delegating to all the pools, that means all the pools will have a lessened incentive to actually perform well. Then you say, okay, yeah, but we'll add in performance metrics, so it has to perform well. Then you get into this thing where you're expecting the system to make decisions about who's worthy of delegation and who's not. And it seems like whenever you do that, the system becomes this bureaucratic machine that doesn't do as good a job as the free market. Can you imagine if the US Department of Agriculture got to decide what food you buy every day? I have a feeling you would end up eating some pretty bad dinners. There's another strain of thought that makes me a little bit more hopeful, and I think it's grounded in something in the direction of first principles thinking. Not necessarily real like physics type first principles thinking, but something in the direction of first principles thinking. So if you ask the question, why do these pools in here, why do they seem to have this momentum where they just get bigger and bigger and bigger? And these pools over here don't seem to experience the same type of growth. You could argue that it's marketing. Maybe these pools are all just doing a better job of marketing. Maybe it's the marketing. Some people have said that. You could also argue it's just miseducation, misunderstanding. The average delegator doesn't understand. They haven't been educated that they'll get the same return on ADA in these small pools as they will in these pools. And of course, if these are oversaturated, then they would get even more over here. I think both those things surely play a role, but there's something else. There's something more than either of those two things. There is also uncertainty and the time value of money. So the miseducation argument, it's based on the idea that people don't understand, hey, in a big pool, you'll get paid more often. In a smaller pool, you might get paid more infrequently, but the return on ADA is going to even out between the two over a long enough timeline. And of course, I think everybody also understands that if a pool is too small, that timeline is too long. But even in less extreme cases, if I say to you, hey, I'm going to give you two choices. I'm going to pay you $1,200 over some timeline. I can either pay you $100 a month for a year, or I'm going to pay you the entire $1,200 in one chunk. And statistically, it's going to happen this year, but it's always possible it could push into next year. You're probably going to choose the $100 a month. You don't want to get 1,200 maybe 12 months from now when you could get $100 a month. Most people are going to choose the $100 a month because they don't like the uncertainty. And there's a certain time value of money. Getting your ADA in these bigger pools every epoch, getting a return on ADA every single epoch is very different than staking to a smaller pool and getting it less frequently, not getting it every epoch. Psychologically, those are two very different circumstances for the average delegator. And I think what we've seen so far is that delegators prefer getting their return on their ADA more frequently. So here's the strain of thought that actually makes me hopeful. What solutions come about when we ask ourselves, how do we solve this time value of money and uncertainty problem for this group of SPOs? How do we make those issues feel the same as these stake pools for the average delegator? You'll remember back on July 22nd in Cardano Rumor Rundown number 128, we covered the Conclave research paper. Conclave was the idea that you could use a weighted threshold signature scheme for a formal design of a collective stake pool, that is, a decentralized pool with no single point of authority. And to be fair, when they say a collective stake pool with no single point of authority, they're thinking of this. They say our design assumes a group of stakeholders who jointly create a stake pool without a single operator. Since large stakeholders typically form pools on their own, our protocol concerns smaller stakeholders who could otherwise not participate directly. Therefore, our design could, for example, be appealing to a group of friends or colleagues who aim for a more steady reward ratio without relying on a third party. So just on the basis of those few sentences, it looks like Conclave was not really meant for a bunch of smaller stake pools to come together and run a joint pool. But what if the same system could be used for that? After all, if a bunch of small single pool operators over in this group could combine into a single collective pool that approaches the same size as one of the saturated pools over here, it seems like that would go a long ways towards solving the time value of money and uncertainty problems for delegators with these small pools. Plus, the weighted threshold signature scheme would allow for no single point of authority for that pool. They could all sort of share authority over the pool together. And it solves one of the biggest problems that kind of jumps in your mind when you read this Conclave paper back in July. They talk about their design being appealing to a group of friends or colleagues. But of course, for a lot of people, if you think about your friends or colleagues, them sharing the actual running of a stake pool with you is probably not something they have on like their Friday night fun to-do list. Small SPOs, though, they're already accustomed to running a stake pool. So this isn't any kind of crazy burden for them. This is exactly what they're trying to do. It looks like these types of ideas are starting to catch on and be proliferated a little bit too. Just today, there was this thread by @Monad Alexander. He said, just started reading, and that's a link to the Conclave paper. My hunch is the reason IOG isn't talking about A naught and K is because stake pools as we know them will be phased out. The abstract and first page or two almost directly address what we are in now. I'm paraphrasing. And then he goes through and he quotes some of the most important parts of the paper. These types of ideas, people are probably, I think, understanding that this may not be something that can be solved just through these parameter changes, and that we actually need something a little bit more out of the box. And maybe that's allowing these smaller stake pools to combine into something that looks a little bit like the scheme laid out in the Conclave paper. So I don't really know what will be the answer to preservation of decentralization of Cardano stake pools. If there is an answer, if we'll just be relegated to greater and greater centralization, nobody really knows what's going to happen. But this kind of idea is intriguing to me as a way to put these small single pool operators on a level playing field with the big multi-pool operators. I hope you're having a good week, and I will talk to you tomorrow.